So for part 4, the one thing that I'm not a big fan about this scene is we have, this peptide that looks really interesting. We have these interesting lights, but the scene just kind of feels empty. I feel like if we were in the cell, there would be more things moving around, maybe some hydrogens, maybe some waters, just some random particles moving around. So what we're going to add is some dust. But dust for us is a little bit harder because dust moves randomly, but it's a looping animation. So that means the beginning and the end needs to be the same, but completely random in the middle. So that's a little bit tricky, but not too hard to do once you know the tricks. So this one will be hard to follow along with, just because it's going to be the first time you see a few new tricks, but you'll know where it is. It's part 4 of this lecture, so if you ever want to add this, just go back and check this lecture and move through it at your own pace. Okay, so first I'm going to make a new collection, and I'm going to call this collection dust, just to keep everything nice and organized. Now, the first object that I'm going to add is I'm going to go up to Mesh, and I'm going to add a icosphere. Icosphere is a lot like a sphere, except for it has way fewer polygons in it, so it's a lot easier and cheaper to render. And this is what I'm going to use to put all my dust particles in. So I'm just going to scale it up. It's a big container. Now next, I'm going to go down to empty and plane axes. This itself isn't like an object with geometry that you could see. It's literally just an empty. You can think of it as like a ghost that you can use through your scene to just move things around. So this is actually going to be what controls our dust. And I want this to kind of loop around, so kind of like orbiting around this sphere. So we just need something to give it an orbit. So I'm just going to add a curve and click circle. You can just go ahead and scale this up until it's kind of sticking outside of your mesh, just like that. And the last thing that we're going to add is go back to your mesh, click the icosphere primitive, and move it up above. This is what we're going to use for our dust. And whenever you're creating dust, always go with the icosphere. It's a great option because it's cheap to render, and all these uneven surfaces makes it so light will bounce off it in like interesting ways as the dust particles move around. So now let's just go ahead and name all these so we can remember what they were for. So our circle, this is our dust path. This empty will control our dust, so I'm going to call it dust controller. This icosphere is what we're going to put the dust in, so dust container. And then this icosphere up here is our dust. Okay, so let's start by working with the controller. So the first thing, if you'll remember, is we want our controller to orbit around our container in a predictable way. So you can go over here to your object constraint properties. Click on it, and you can add a constraint. There's a lot of pre-built ones, so if you want to do something, you can often find your constraint here, but I just want it to follow a path. And so the target, I want it to follow the path of this orbit that's around here. So you can just click the eyedropper, hover over it, and click. You can see that our controller just snaps right to our circle that we've put around it. Now, you wouldn't know this ahead of time, so you would have to fiddle around, but the influence is how much this controller is going to control the dust. And so 1 is really high, so I just want it to be a subtle movement. I don't want dust particles flying all over the place, since the temperature inside cells is very moderate. So 0.03 should be good. Okay, now we're going to animate our controller such that it orbits around. And this is easy to do. So just go back to frame 1, and your offset is where it is along the orbit. So 0 would be no offset. So just right click, insert a keyframe. Now you can go to your very last frame, which is 151, So this would be the next, this would be where frame 1 and 151 are the same in our animation. So I'm just going to put it at the offset at 100%, so all the way around, and insert a keyframe. So now when you play through the animation, if you look closely, you can see that that little circle in the middle is spinning around. You can also see, if you look closely, it's very faint, so it's not easy to see, but you can see this blue line. You can see it kind of moving. The one thing that you might want to change is that, again, this is hard to notice, so you might have to take my word for it. At the beginning, it starts off moving very slow, and then it speeds up. It's kind of like a car taking off. It doesn't start off at 60 miles an hour. It takes time to ramp up. But we don't want that, or else in our animation, it would start off slow, go faster, faster, then slow down, and then go faster, so you could tell where the break in the loop was. So that's called the interpolation. So you can just click on your frame, right-click it, and change your interpolation mode. And I want to change it to linear. And I can just do that with your end frame so that they both just start, they end and start as if there was no difference. And so if you were to play through it, you would see that it just, the line just goes at a normal speed. Okay. The next thing that we're going to work with is our dust container. And the dust container, it's going to it's going to move around in kind of like a random, kind of like a wave is moving it, such that the particles that are inside are just going to move with the container. So that's the trick that we're going to do. If you click on your modifiers, so this is if you want to change a geometry in some way, they have pre-built functions that you can usually find what you're looking for in here. So you can just say add a modifier. And the modifier that I want to add is displacement. So this will, we can change it, displace the modifier in a predictable way. So if I press the strength here, so you can see that the sphere got bigger when I created it. So just so we can see what's going on, you can decrease that to 0.1 so that we can see our orbit again. But if you press on new, so add a new material to displace it, you can change this to an object, so the coordinates that it's going to be controlled by. And so you can click on an object, and the object that I want to control it with is our dust controller. So just use the eyedropper and click on that. Oh, I might have clicked on dust container. That's why I said I didn't want to. So dust controller is what you want to click on there. So now, if you were to move along the timeline, you'd see that nothing's happening yet. But that's because it's not controlling it with any specific texture. So to change the texture, there's a texture tab down here that we really haven't worked with. And there's a shortcut to get to that. If you hover over this, it says show texture in texture tab. So if you click on that, it'll just bring you to that tab. And we can change our texture. So I'm going to change it specifically to this Stooky texture. Click on that. And if I run through the animation now you can see that, if this was a cell, it would look like it's blebbing or something, but it's kind of got this motion to it. This is a little bit too extreme in my taste. I would kind of want it to be like water flowing rather than like the surface getting distorted. So I'm just going to change the size of the randomness in this texture to 1.75. And you can kind of see how the noise changed. And now you can see like it's this much slower change. So now you want to add something inside of it. And this is going to be your introduction to particle simulations. You can just have full-blown simulations inside Blender that are physically accurate if you want. And so you can just click on this right here, add a new particle system. And switch it from emitter to hair. And so you can see that you now have these hair paths coming off your object. Click Advanced, and then under Render, you can see why we get those hairs, so it's rendering it as a path. Instead, we want to render this as an object. And you probably can guess what we're going to put in here. So the object that we want to render is our dust. And so now you can see that you have all these dust particles all over our container. But we don't want the dust on the container. If you jump inside, just click the camera view, you can see what we would see just lining the container. That's not quite right. So click on Source, and you can choose where they're being emitted from. So right now they're emitting from the face, but we can emit them from the volume. And now we have our dust all over our volume. Currently they're fairly large. So if you go back to your render, you can make them so that some are big, some are small, which is a nice effect. So change this to the max, which is 1. And if you can't see that, that's the scale randomness. There you go. I don't want that hidden. The other thing you can change is if you feel like these dust particles are too big, feel free to change that here. So you don't need to worry about sizing your dust at all. You can just press 0.02 and they're a lot smaller, or 0.03. And the last thing that I want to change is this gigantic icosphere has served its purpose. We don't need it anymore. And so it's really easy to get rid of. You can just see that there's this show emitter here. And if you go under viewport, there's also a show emitter. You can just uncheck these and it's gone. And so you don't have to worry about looking at that anymore. And so there you go. The last thing that you can change is if you wanted to give it a specific material. So for example, if you wanted it to look like embers, you would just change the color to red. If you want it to look like dust, maybe like a gray, hydrogen's white. So I'm just going to go down to my textures, add a new texture. And I'm going to leave everything the same. Maybe I'm going to switch roughness to 0 so that it's really shiny. I'm going to switch transmission. So this is like, if you look at dust, they're not hard spheres. It's kind of like some light does pass through the dust. So I'm going to change this to 0.9. And so now let's take a look to see our objects. I'm going to go ahead and save it. That slight glitch scared me. Okay, just in case. So now if you were to watch this animation, you can see we've got a lot of stuff moving, and this is very nicely, I think it's coming together. So we have the beginning and the end are the same. We have these dust particles that just look like they're randomly moving around, although because they're controlled by the same object, they kind of look like there's some coordination. They're just not randomly flying around. And then we have our lights that are switching in the background. And just to check out the rendered view, this is kind of what it looks like. You can see that our depth of field is really taking care of these dust particles. Some of them are lighting up red from the red, some are lighting up blue. So this is kind of the effect I was hoping to get. So that ends section 4.